Today's meeting in Rome between top American and Chinese officials was preceded by reporting that Moscow had asked Beijing for military assistance in its war against Ukraine. China has so far stayed somewhat removed from the conflict, even if tacitly supportive of Russia. Amna Nawaz is here now with a deeper look at that.
That's right, Judy. A senior administration official told reporters this afternoon the Rome meeting was a, quote, intense 7-hour session with, quote, very candid conversation between the two officials, and that U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan conveyed deep concerns about China's alignment with Russia. Here with me now to look at both China's role and the wider American response to Ukraine are Bonnie Glaser. She's the director of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund. That's a policy organization focused on the United States and Europe. And Eric Edelman. He was Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the George W. Bush administration. He is now at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. That's a National Security Research Institute. Welcome to you both. And Eric, I'd like to start with you and those reports that Russia has requested both military support and economic assistance from China in this moment. If true, what does that say to you about how Vladimir Putin is assessing this moment in time, where Russia is and where they could go next?
Well, I think two things, Amna. One, both sides have actually denied that this is the case, so we need to keep our minds open about it. But the U.S. government has told allies that Russia was seeking some assistance for the military operation in Ukraine, which I think does suggest that they're running into some very severe shortfalls and logistical problems, which they hope the Chinese will help them with.
And Bonnie, what about this story about potential economic assistance? We know, of course, Russia is facing deep and devastating sanctions from the U.S. and others in the world. Is it possible China would step in to fill some of that financial void?
It's highly unlikely that the Chinese would directly violate sanctions. We've seen in the past when there are sanctions, for example, in 2014 against Russia, the Chinese banks essentially complied. The commercial banks in China don't want to risk getting cut off from the international financial system. But of course, the Chinese can find creative ways to circumvent sanctions. They have done so with North Korea and with Iran. For example, the Chinese could let Russia's central bank cash in on some of the $140 billion that it holds in Chinese bonds. It could use its policy banks to provide loans directly to Russian enterprises instead of going through Russian banks. But at the end of the day, I think China will be careful. It does not want to suffer secondary sanctions from the United States.
So Bonnie, as we mentioned, all this happens amid that high-level meeting in Rome. We should mention it was previously scheduled as well as a follow-up to the virtual meeting between Presidents Biden and Leader Xi. But, they did say that there's an importance of maintaining open lines of communication here. I guess from your perspective, what is the best case scenario for the U.S. coming out of that meeting with China?
Well, the best case scenario, I think, is that there's some understanding between the United States and China about how to address some very high priority security issues. Ukraine, number one. Another one is North Korea, which reportedly may be firing off an ICBM in the coming months. There are many issues between the United States and China that need to be dealt with. And so what we need to have is sustained dialogue with China with some very clear pathways forward about how to address some of these issues. And to do that, we need to build more mutual trust in the relationship. That is very, very difficult at this point. Xi Jinping views the United States as a country in decline. It sees Western democracies as having failed, and Xi Jinping has aligned himself very closely with Putin and with Russia. And so I think that this is going to be very difficult for the U.S. and China to find ways to work together to address these issues.
So, Eric, if you are one of those U.S. officials in these meetings right now, in what they call, this moment of crisis, you're meeting with those Chinese officials. We did press that senior administration official for details about what was asked from the U.S. perspective. And as far as they would go was to say, look, there was a candid, direct exchange of views, and they made clear that there would be consequences of certain actions. If you're a U.S. official, what are you asking for from China right now as you're looking to contain Russia?
Well, as you know, Presidents Putin and Xi signed a document saying that they had an unlimited partnership. And I think what the U.S. officials and what Jake Sullivan were doing were trying to actually hem in the limits of that partnership and make clear to their Chinese interlocutors that there will be real costs, in not just in the U.S.-China relationship, but more broadly, if China, for instance, were to violate the sanctions, even as Bonnie was saying, finding creative ways around the sanctions. But in particular, I think they were trying to convey that providing military assistance to Russia at this point in time would create some real difficulties, because it does raise all sorts of escalation issues. My understanding from seeing some press reporting is that what allegedly was being asked of China was for surface-to-air missiles, drones, which have been very effective and effectively used by Ukraine, logistics vehicles like heavy trucks, armored vehicles, but also things like MREs, meals ready to eat, prepackaged food, which tells you just how poorly this operation was planned by the Russians and how much they're bumping up against the logistical obstacles. And if China were to help Russia overcome some of those logistical obstacles, it would clearly change potentially the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine, which is not going well for Russia right now.
Eric, just to follow up on that, it's not going well for Russia, but we did obviously see over the weekend a slight escalation with those attacks in western Ukraine, now very close to the Polish border. What's your assessment of that?
Well, that was clearly a message to the U.S. Russia is clearly unhappy about the military equipment. The facility that was hit is a facility that the U.S. has used in the past to train and exercise with the Ukrainian military. So it was clearly a message that although the fighting has largely been in the northeast and south of Ukraine, that Russia has the capability to hit west as well. And basically a warning, as have been other actions taken by Russia, including the nuclear threats that they've made, as well as the discussion that has been undertaken by Russian media about the potential for chemical and biological weapons use, which in many cases is seen, I think correctly, as a potentially a precursor to their use of those weapons in this conflict, which would be a very severe escalation, of course.
So, Eric, just to follow up on that, and in the minute we have left, how then do you see, given all that, the refusal of the Biden administration and NATO member nations to enforce a no-fly zone, which we know President Zelensky has repeatedly asked for?
Well, there are some very serious technical obstacles to a no-fly zone. I personally would prefer to see an effort at something more limited, which would be a humanitarian exclusion zone to allow people to be evacuated from the cities under siege and for food and medicine and humanitarian goods to get through. And I think proposing things like that actually shines a light on the total barbaric nature of this military operation.
Bonnie, very briefly, given this critical moment right now, what should be the U.S. message to China moving forward?
Well, the U.S. message to China should first be not to backfill the sanctions, circumvent them in any way, not to help Russia's economy, not to help its military. And if it has any leverage at all that it can use in a conversation between Xi Jinping and Russia's President Putin to call an end to this war, to implement a ceasefire, to get Russia to accept some outcome that is less than what Putin hoped for, to begin negotiations with President Zelensky. I think that China should use that leverage. And I think that our National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, likely conveyed those messages to Yang Jiechi when he met with him in Rome.
That is Bonnie Glaser and Eric Edelman joining us tonight. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.